Good morning, First Baptist. Glad to be doing this live stream with you. We are going to be looking at Psalm 13 this morning, and going to be continuing our devotional through the Psalms, and excited to be doing that with you. So we yesterday looked at Psalm 12, and what we saw in Psalm 12 was how even as Christians, it's still possible to have some sort of a emotional darkness or a emotional cloud over us that can be overcome with our faith in God, but is still something that can surround us. And we see that in the way that Psalm 12 ends in verse 8. On every side the wicked prowl, as vileness is exalted among the children of mankind. So David ends this psalm with a darker ending, and it's indicative of the honesty that the psalms wish to portray, and the realness and the humanness in them, and the fact that the writers live in a broken world is clear. So we have to keep that in mind as we continue to move through the psalms, that David has done us the favor and the service of being honest in these psalms with himself and honest with the Lord. And we're so thankful for him in doing those things and giving us a real human look into emotion and into living life in faith in spite of the pain that can come through the trials that God brings into our lives. So Psalm 13 is very much still in that vein. As he continues through, we see David asked the Lord, how long will these things sort of go on? And then he asked God to consider him and to save him and to deliver him, and the reasons why he wants God to do that. And then in verses 5 and 6, we see the response of David to asking the Lord for deliverance. We see that in verses 5 and 6. So it's a shorter psalm, so we're going to look through it. And I think what we're going to see is what happens when faith, what is the result of faith, and how faith can overcome even the darkest of questions and the darkest of times. So Psalm 13, verse 1, David says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" So there's several things happening here. David feels like he's been forgotten by the Lord. He feels like God is hiding his face from him. And of course, the face of God, the God's shining his face upon you, is a sign of blessing or a sign of intimacy and closeness or security with the Lord. David feels like God has hidden his face from him. How long must I take counsel in my soul? What that could be referring to is the feeling that David has that when he asks a question, he himself has to answer his own question, because he doesn't feel like there's a communion there with God. God feels distant to him. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? So David's going through a tough time here, right? He's going through several difficulties. He feels very emotionally distant from God. His enemies are having victory over him. He's sorrowful, and he feels like God is far off. And I'm sure we all can think of times where we've felt these things, maybe even have expressed these sort of ideas along with David, and can definitely see ourselves in this place that David finds himself in. And that's what is so nice about the Psalms, is how honest they are and how real they are to true life and to life living in a broken world by faith. Verse 3, he calls out to God to answer him. "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Lift up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." So he wants God to lift his eyes up, right? Which is a lifter of my head idea, where he's lifting David's head up so that his countenance is raised, so that his prospects are better, so that he feels close to God. God is delivering him. God is helping him, sustaining him, all of those things. For a few reasons. Lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. So these are the reasons why David wants God to deliver him. Now, what's interesting is we don't have God's answer in between verses 4 and 5. There's several times in the Psalms where God does answer things and say things. We don't have that in verses 4 through 5. So the response in verse 5 is interesting. He says, "But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Now, like I said, God does not respond to David in between these verses. We don't know if God responded to him in real time, but he doesn't do it in these verses. And the question is how does David move from sorrowful to rejoicing? How does David do that? And because it's likely that the outward circumstances have not changed for David in that short amount of time, how does David go from sorrowful to rejoicing? And the answer to that is faith. The way David goes from being sorrowful, feeling that God is distant, to rejoicing is that he has faith in God and faith in God's promises. And what the area that he has faith in is found in verse 5. He has faith in God's steadfast love. God's steadfast love. So love is the antidote for any sort of doubt that you feel that God is not for you. God's steadfast covenantal love is the absolute key to overcoming any sort of fear that you have that God is not going to do good for you in the end. And this trust, this faith leads to joy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. So his trust in the steadfast love leads to his heart rejoicing in the salvation of God. And then this is interesting as well. What happens next is that he sings. I will sing to the Lord. So faith, true faith in God's love, always begets worship. Faith always makes worship. And that's how you know that your faith is active, is you worship. And we see this with Job, right? What does he do right after everything is lost? He is sorrowful, but then he worships, right? And that's because his faith was placed in God. And he didn't have the answers, and he was going to ask questions after. But his faith, he exercised faith in God, and then he worshiped, because faith always creates worship. Now, if you look at verse 6 and you look back at verse 1, I will sing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. He has dealt bountifully with me. If you look at verses 1 and 2, that is not a way that I would describe God dealing bountifully with somebody, right? Would you? Let's just read verses 1 through 2 again. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Is that a way that you would describe God dealing bountifully with somebody? I would not, but that is me answering the question with my wisdom. And if you said no, which if you're like me, you would say no, that is you answering the question with your wisdom. But with the eyes of faith, if we have those eyes of faith, we can look back on anything and say that God has dealt bountifully with us in and through and by those things at all times. You can look back on a life of tragedy and say, God has dealt bountifully with me in this way. And that is what faith can do to our perspective. It can give us a positive and building perspective rather than one that would be destructive or depressed or down, because we always see that God is going to be working good even through the hard things. And we can look back like David does and say, man, it's been rough these past few months, but God is working mighty things through all of these things. And faith says that that is good, even though it doesn't feel good at times. So, I mean, one of the biggest themes so far that I've noticed in just studying the Psalms is how important it is to approach all things with the eyes of faith, and to see all things the way that God would have us see them, and not the way that we might be naturally inclined to see them. So I pray God gives you those eyes of faith as you approach this day, and as you continue in this week, and as we all continue to work through this quarantine and all this stuff that's going on, that we don't see them with our eyes, but we see them with the eyes of faith that God gives to us by means of his Son. So I pray that you're able to do that, and we miss all of you, and we're looking forward to being meeting again soon. And the church is just far too empty, and looking into the sanctuary with all the empty pews and everything, it just is something that we're really looking forward to filling back up. And by the grace of God, in his time and in his plan, he will have this place reopened, and we'll all be able to worship again soon. So we look forward to that, and hoping you guys are all doing well. And if there's any needs or any prayer requests or anything that come up, please reach out. And Pastor Ben and I are here to meet those needs as much as we can. And Pastor Ben will be going live tomorrow and on Thursday. And then I'll be back with you guys on Friday to look at Psalm 14. Looking forward to those times together.